Officer Rick Daniels tapped his fingers impatiently on the dashboard of his patrol car, parked on the corner of Henderson Avenue. The summer heat radiated off the asphalt, making the air thick and stifling. He took a sip of his now lukewarm coffee and sighed. It was just another slow afternoon shift. Nothing exciting, nothing out of the ordinary, until he spotted the sleek black SUV cruising past him. Something about it rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the polished exterior, the way it glided down the road too smoothly. Maybe it was just a gut feeling, or maybe it was the fact that he could see the driver was a black man. Rick narrowed his eyes and flicked on his siren without hesitation. The SUV didn't speed up or attempt to evade him. Instead, the vehicle slowed down and pulled over gracefully, following protocol to the letter. That irked Rick even more. In his mind, anyone who looked like that driving a car that nice had to be up to something. With a grunt, Rick unbuckled his seatbelt, adjusted his belt, and stepped out of his cruiser. His boots clunked against the pavement as he strode toward the driver's side window. He rested his hand on his holster, not out of necessity but as a silent intimidation tactic. "Roll down the window," Rick barked. There was a brief pause before the window hummed downward, revealing the driver, a tall, well-dressed man with a calm expression. He looked to be in his mid-40s, his sharp eyes meeting Rick's with a steady confidence that immediately irritated the officer. Rick hated that look, that calm self-assurance, that unwavering composure. It was something he wasn't used to seeing in people like this. "License and registration," Rick demanded, his tone laced with hostility. The man didn't argue. He simply reached into his glove compartment, retrieved his documents, and handed them over without a word. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost as if he knew exactly how to handle situations like this. Rick glanced at the ID, grinding his teeth as he read the name. James Carter. No middle name. No nonsense. Just James Carter. "What's your business in this part of town, Carter?" Rick questioned, flipping through the registration papers without actually reading them. James tilted his head slightly, as if the question amused him. "Driving," he answered simply. Rick's jaw tightened. He didn't like that tone. Steady, confident, unfazed. He was used to people squirming when he pulled them over, stammering out explanations, pleading their innocence. But James? He sat there like he had nothing to prove, like he had nothing to fear. "Don't get smart with me," Rick snapped, leaning in closer. "I asked what you were doing around here." James exhaled slowly, unbothered. "Officer, is there a reason you pulled me over?" Rick's grip tightened on the license. He wanted a reason. He was searching for one, anything he could use. He glanced inside the SUV, scanning for contraband, weapons, anything illegal. But the car was spotless. No signs of trouble. No justifiable cause. Still, he wasn't about to back down. "You were driving suspiciously," Rick said, the excuse weak even to his own ears. James arched a brow. "Suspiciously? I was going the speed limit, signaling correctly, and obeying all traffic laws." Rick's frustration boiled beneath the surface. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone like James Carter. "Are you resisting, Carter?" Rick said, voice dripping with thinly veiled threat. James let out a short chuckle, low, controlled, like a man who had been in far too many situations like this before. He shook his head, resting his hands casually on the steering wheel. "No, officer. Just making sure my rights are being respected." That was it. That was the breaking point. Rick's face darkened, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "Listen here, you little," he sneered, before spitting out the word like venom. "Monkey." The word hung in the air, thick with racist malice. It was the kind of insult that could shatter a weaker man, the kind of slur meant to put someone in their place. But James didn't flinch. He didn't tense up, didn't react the way Rick had wanted him to. Instead, he smiled. A slow, deliberate smirk curved on his lips, as if he knew something Rick didn't. Rick's face twisted with confusion, anger flashing in his eyes. Why wasn't he angry? Why wasn't he scared? James calmly reached for his ID and gestured for Rick to return it. "Are we done here, officer?" Rick wanted to lash out, to find a reason to drag James out of the car, to show him who had the real power here. But before he could think of his next move, his radio crackled to life. "Dispatch to all units. Be advised, the new chief of police is scheduled to arrive in the city today. All officers are expected to conduct themselves accordingly." Rick barely paid attention to the message, too focused on the man in front of him. But James's smirk only grew wider. "Thank you for your service, officer," James said smoothly, reaching for his ID. His fingers lightly brushed against Rick's as he took it back. "I'll be seeing you again very soon." There was something off about the way he said it. Not a threat, not a warning, just a statement. Rick felt a cold shiver run down his spine, though he couldn't explain why. Without another word, James rolled up his window, shifted his car into gear, and smoothly pulled away, leaving Rick standing in the dust. The officer clenched his fists, watching the black SUV disappear into the distance. Who the hell did that guy think he was? Little did Rick know he was about to find out very soon, and when he did, it would be too late to undo his mistake. Rick Daniels arrived at the Westwood Police Precinct in a foul mood. He had spent the entire night brooding over his encounter with that arrogant James Carter. The way the man had smirked, the way he had driven off without fear, it gnawed at Rick's nerves. Who the hell did that guy think he was? As Rick stepped inside, the station was unusually bustling with activity. Officers, detectives, and administrative staff were gathered in the briefing room, whispering among themselves. A few sergeants stood near the front, their expressions serious but expectant. Rick furrowed his brow. "What's going on?" he muttered to his colleague, Officer Travis Mitchell. Travis, a stocky man in his late 40s, glanced at Rick with mild amusement. "Didn't you read the memo? We're getting a new chief of police today. Big announcement." Rick blinked. "Already? I thought Reynolds was staying until the end of the month." Travis shrugged. "Guess the department wanted a fresh start." Rick crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, watching as Captain Reynolds, the outgoing chief of police, walked to the front of the room. Reynolds was an older man with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, immediately commanding attention. "All right, listen up," Reynolds began. "As most of you know, today marks an important transition for this precinct. After 35 years of service, I am stepping down as chief of police, and as of today, the department has appointed a new leader to take my place." A murmur rippled through the room. Most of the officers were curious, some even excited, to see who the department had chosen. Reynolds raised a hand to silence the chatter. "Before I introduce him, let me make one thing clear. He is a man of exceptional service, with a track record that speaks for itself. He's worked in multiple cities, leading crime reduction initiatives and reform policies that have made headlines across the country. The department expects us all to give him the respect he deserves." Rick scoffed quietly. "Great. Another suit who thinks he knows how to run the streets better than us." Travis smirked. "Careful, Rick. You don't want to start off on the wrong foot with the new boss." Rick rolled his eyes. He wasn't worried. He'd been with the force for over 12 years, long enough to know that these new chiefs always came in talking big, only to realize they didn't understand real police work. Reynolds took a step to the side and gestured toward the door. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you your new chief of police, James Carter." Silence. A cold, stunned, deafening silence filled the room. Rick froze, his body locking up like a statue. His pulse pounded in his ears as he watched James Carter stride into the room, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, his badge gleaming against his chest. The same James Carter he had pulled over. The same James Carter he had insulted. The same James Carter he had called a monkey. Rick's throat went dry as Carter surveyed the room with the same calm, commanding presence he had in the driver's seat the night before. He stopped at the front of the room, hands folded in front of him, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. And then his gaze landed on Rick. Rick felt it instantly, that piercing, knowing stare. James Carter remembered him. Rick's stomach twisted into knots. Carter's expression didn't change. No anger, no smug satisfaction. Just that same quiet confidence. He let the silence linger for a moment longer before finally speaking. "Good morning," he said smoothly, his voice deep and authoritative. "It's an honor to be standing here today as your new chief of police." The room remained stiff, officers trying to process what was happening. Then, one by one, a few began clapping. The rest hesitated, then joined in, some out of respect, others out of obligation. Rick couldn't move. He couldn't even breathe properly. How was this happening? Carter continued. "I've worked with law enforcement in multiple cities, and I've seen both the best and worst of what this profession has to offer. My goal isn't to shake things up for the sake of it. I'm here to work with you, to build on what's already been established, and to ensure that this precinct serves its community with integrity and fairness." Rick swallowed hard at that last part. Carter clasped his hands behind his back. "I know some of you are wondering about my leadership style, my approach to law enforcement, and what changes might be coming. I won't be making any rash decisions. But let me be clear. This department will uphold the values of justice, equality, and professionalism at all times." His eyes flickered back to Rick for a split second, just long enough for Rick to feel the weight of the words. Rick clenched his jaw. He knows. He definitely knows. Carter continued his speech, discussing future department initiatives, community engagement programs, and training improvements. The more he spoke, the clearer it became. This man wasn't just some paper pusher in a suit. He was smart, experienced, and well-respected. And now he was Rick's boss. As the meeting wrapped up, officers clapped again, some genuinely excited, others still cautious about what this change would mean. Carter thanked everyone for their time, then stepped aside to shake hands with the precinct's leadership team. Rick turned to leave, hoping to slip out unnoticed, but just as he reached the door, Officer Daniels, his heart stopped. Slowly, he turned around to see Carter looking directly at him, a polite but pointed smile on his face. "Mind staying for a moment? I'd love to have a quick word." Rick's palms went clammy. He forced a tight, uneasy smile. "Of course, Chief." Travis shot him a look that screamed, "You're screwed." As the other officers filed out, Rick stood there, trapped, knowing full well that his biggest mistake had just walked into his precinct. And there was no escaping it now. The briefing room slowly emptied as officers filed out, murmuring about their first impressions of the new chief of police. Some were intrigued, others hesitant, and a few, like Rick Daniels, were outright terrified. Rick stood frozen in place, his mind racing. This can't be happening. He had spent years in the force, bending the rules when he saw fit, assuming his rank and tenure would protect him. But now, standing face to face with the one man he had humiliated just the night before, it felt like the walls were closing in. Chief James Carter stood across the room, still talking with some of the senior officers, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. His voice was even his body language confident. If Rick hadn't known better, he might have thought Carter had forgotten about their previous encounter. But Rick wasn't that lucky. As soon as the last officer exited, Carter turned to Rick. "Officer Daniels." Rick felt his throat tighten. "Yes, sir?" Carter gestured toward his office. "Let's have a chat." Rick forced himself to move, each step heavier than the last. He had faced violent criminals, stared down the barrels of loaded guns, and walked through the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city. Yet, at that moment, he had never felt more vulnerable. Private conversation. Carter's office was clean and organized, a stark contrast to the mess inside Rick's head. A small nameplate sat on the desk. Chief James Carter. Rick's stomach turned. That name should have meant nothing to me. Just another guy. Just another random stop. But now it meant everything. Carter took a seat behind the desk and motioned for Rick to sit as well. Rick hesitated but obeyed. He sat stiffly, hands clasped together to keep them from shaking. Carter folded his hands on the desk and regarded him for a long, agonizing moment. Then, with a polite yet piercing calmness, he said, "Do you recognize me, Officer Daniels?" Rick felt his pulse pound in his ears. He could lie. He could play dumb. But something in Carter's expression told him it wouldn't matter. I think so, sir," Rick admitted, forcing his voice to stay steady. Carter nodded slowly. You pulled me over last night. Highway 14. Correct. Rick swallowed hard. Yes, sir. And during that stop, would you say you conducted yourself professionally? Rick's jaw tightened. This was a trap, and he knew it. If he admitted wrongdoing, he'd be dug into a hole he couldn't climb out of. But if he denied it, Carter might have proof. Rick cleared his throat. I believe I followed protocol, sir. Carter let out a quiet hum. Interesting. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a tablet, and with a few taps, turned the screen toward Rick. Rick's stomach dropped. It was dashcam footage from his patrol car. Rick watched himself dig his own grave, his own voice poisoning the air. He couldn't deny it now. Carter let the silence stretch before finally speaking. Would you still say you followed protocol? Rick's mouth opened, then closed. His mind raced for excuses, but none of them seemed convincing. Not when the evidence was right there. Rick swallowed. I was having a bad night. Carter didn't blink. A bad night? Rick forced a weak nod. Yes, sir. I was frustrated. I thought you were being difficult, and I said things I shouldn't have. Carter tilted his head slightly. So, if I wasn't your superior, would this still be things you shouldn't have said? Or would it just be another regular traffic stop for you? Rick clenched his fists, feeling exposed. Carter leaned back in his chair. Officer Daniels, I've worked in law enforcement long enough to recognize when a man is truly remorseful and when he's just trying to save his own skin. Rick felt the blood drain from his face. Carter exhaled slowly and placed his hands flat on the desk. I'll be frank with you, Daniels. If I weren't sitting here today as your chief, you wouldn't have thought twice about what you did. You've probably done it before, maybe even worse. And if no one was watching, you'd do it again. Rick's lips parted, but he couldn't argue, because deep down, it was true. Carter straightened. Effective immediately, an internal investigation is being launched against you. Rick's head snapped up. Wait, Chief. Carter held up a hand. Save it. His voice remained calm, but his tone carried finality. Your actions last night went beyond unprofessional. They were a disgrace to this uniform. Rick gritted his teeth, his mind reeling. If an investigation went through, he could be suspended or worse, fired. His hands trembled. Everything I worked for. Carter studied him for a moment before standing. That'll be all, Daniels. Dismissed. Rick hesitated, debating whether to plead, argue, or fight back. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. Carter had already won. Rick rose from his chair, his legs weak. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, his career hanging by a thread. As he stepped into the hallway, the world around him felt different. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one in control. And it terrified him. Rick Daniels had spent years in the force, believing he was untouchable. His badge had shielded him from consequences. His seniority had granted him immunity, and his prejudices had gone unchecked for far too long. But now, as he stood outside Chief James Carter's office, his entire career teetered on the edge of destruction. The investigation into his conduct had begun immediately after his humiliating meeting with the new chief. The precinct was buzzing with rumors. Officers whispered in the break room, some exchanging knowing glances, while others nervously speculated about what would happen next. Would Daniels be fired? Would Carter make an example out of him? For the first time in years, Rick felt powerless. 2 days later, the call came. Officer Daniels, report to the chief's office. Rick's stomach clenched. He had barely slept since that night. His mind had been a battlefield of excuses, regrets, and anger, but deep down he knew he had been caught. He stepped into the office, where Chief Carter was seated behind his desk, alongside 2 internal affairs officers. Carter didn't waste time. Officer Daniels, he began, his tone calm but firm, following the review of your recent conduct and prior complaints that have surfaced, the department has decided to place you on indefinite suspension pending further investigation. Rick's face turned red. Chief, Carter held up a hand. Save it. The words stung. I warned you, Daniels. This department doesn't tolerate disrespect, racism, or abuse of power. This badge is a symbol of justice, not a shield for bigotry. Rick clenched his fists. I've been on this force for 15 years. You can't just... Yes, I can, Carter interrupted. And I will. Silence fell over the room. One of the internal affairs officers slid a document across the desk. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties. Hand in your badge and firearm. Rick's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a warning. This was real. With trembling hands, he reached for his badge, unpinned it from his chest, and set it on the desk. Then, slowly, he placed his service weapon beside it. The weight of consequences had never felt so crushing. Daniels, Carter said as Rick turned to leave. Rick paused. This department will be better without you. Rick felt something inside him shatter. As he walked out, every officer in the precinct turned to watch him. Some shook their heads, others looked relieved, and a few smirked. For the first time in his life, Rick Daniels realized he wasn't the predator, he was the prey. With Rick gone, a shift took place within the precinct. For years, officers like him had poisoned the force with unchecked bias and intimidation tactics. But under Chief James Carter's leadership, those days were over. Slowly but surely, officers who had once looked the other way when discrimination happened started speaking up. The culture was changing. One afternoon, as James walked through the precinct, a young black officer approached him. "Chief," the officer said, shifting nervously, I wanted to say thank you. A lot of us have been waiting for someone like you to come along." James nodded, placing a reassuring hand on the officer's shoulder. "This department belongs to all of us," he said. "And as long as I'm here, we do things the right way." For the first time in years, the precinct felt like a place of justice again. Meanwhile, Rick Daniels' career was in ruins. The investigation revealed more complaints against him: unlawful stops, excessive force, and racial profiling. His name was dragged through the mud, and the media picked up on the scandal. Soon, he wasn't just suspended, he was forced to resign. His reputation, destroyed. His career, over. His future, uncertain. And the worst part? The man he had called a monkey was now his former boss, the chief of police, the very person who took him down. As James stood in his office, looking out at the city he had sworn to protect, he knew that this was just the beginning. Justice had been served, but there was still so much more work to do. And he was ready, because this time the right man was in charge.